Good evening, OPN, and our other friendly channels that are mirroring us. Thank you very much for tuning in tonight. We're very fortunate to have Yotam Marom, who is from New York. And Yotam is a writer, activist, organizer, and educator based in the city, as I said, and he's a member of the Organization for a Free Society. Um, Yotam has been active in Occupy Wall Street since it began, and in the research that I did, he's actually active in the precursors to Occupy Wall Street, the Bloomberg bill. So he has, a solid background in the activism there in the city. He has experience in student organizing, anti-austerity struggles, democratic education, and communal living. So we're really fortunate to have you here. Thank you so much. And I do want to tell the chatters and viewers that Yotam is here, and he's been a little under the weather, so we're going to try to be pretty conscious of his time. But I'm grateful to have him here and looking forward to our conversation. Thank you for being on with us tonight, sir.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
So we'll go ahead and launch right into it. And my first question, because you are such a wonderful writer and you have a fairly, round and all-encompassing vision of what, the movement entails and what it could be, its history, and its possible future. I would like you to maybe describe what you think the roles and responsibility of new media are in movements for social justice.
Um, okay, well, first of all, thank you for the introduction. That was very kind. Um, this is a big question, and I guess, to be honest, I'm not really from a media background, so I'm not sure exactly, but I could give a guess, and I think that, I think that you all do it. I think what you're doing is exactly the right thing. I think what a lot of the sort of new and independent media that's out there is doing is exactly right, which is amplifying the voices of people in struggle, primarily, and with an emphasis on frontline communities and people who are marginalized and have less access to mainstream media. And so I think, I think there's a lot of ways to do that. And some of it is about, I think, telling the truth. And some of it is about telling about possibility. I think that's a lot of what new media is really important for, because I think that maybe in the 60s and in the 50s and a little bit beyond, what was really important about alternative media was telling the truth, was just showing that Vietnam was happening, for example, was a really big deal because people didn't know it. And the assumption was if people knew, they'd be our age and they would do something about it. And I think, although that might have been true, and it's still true in some senses, of course, people need to know the truth. I think we're battling a different beast right now, that it's a little less about knowing what's out there and a little bit about knowing what's possible. It's more about knowing what's possible. People have gotten a lot of, really heavy barrage of there is no alternative. Like, yeah, sure, it's messed up. That's fine. Everybody agrees on that. Not everybody agrees, but a lot of people agree on that. People agree that the world we live in right now is not the world they want to live in. But they're just kind of handicapped by the question of what the alternative is. And I think so. I think, new media is shedding light on that. I think is really an important contribution.
And in the phrase new media, I do include your writing and blogging. I think it's a great illustration of how to use the written word to further the cause and also provide context and history. Um, Now, my experience with your writing has been on For Louder Days. Had you been writing and publishing previously to that, and previous to the Occupy movement?
A little bit. Yeah. I mean, I guess I wrote a little bit about. Uh, I wrote for ZNet's Reimagining Society project
Mhm.
a couple of years ago, and I wrote a piece on re-envisioning communal living you know as a as a hub for both external struggle and sort of creating the world we want to live in. And I wrote a piece about participatory education and what that would look like. But I think my writing was really different then actually, and it's only when about struggles actually taking place that I felt like my writing actually was resonating. It just took some people telling me like, look, this thing's happening. Not that many people aren't there.
Yotam, let me.
And it's like a wacky time
There we
for
go.
of Occupy. You good?
Yeah, we're good. We were getting a little bit of Skype network choppiness there. I think I would like to remake the connection, so I'm going to hang up and I'll call you right back, okay?
Okay, sure.
Sorry about that, folks. It's the way it goes when we use the old Skype, so we'll give it a whirl again. Yeah, there we go. Much better.
Okay.
Sorry about that. You know, it's
That's okay.
we're at the mercy of the tools. So you
Yeah.
you
All right.
yeah. So you had a background in some writing, but it be has been more recently focused on Occupy and Occupy activities.
Totally.
I want to get in because some of these questions are really personal to me and things that I would like to learn from you. Um, can you just tell us why local organizing is so important? What is the value of local organizing on your block, in your neighborhood, in your town?
Well, it's kind of, I mean, there really isn't any other way to win. Is the point? Especially not the world we want to win. And I don't think that local organizing is in any sense opposed to organizing on a grand scale or on a national scale, on a global scale. I think we have to do all of those things. But the local organizing part that's where people are. I mean, that's not only what forms the foundational building blocks of our society, but it's also that nucleus that's going to need to form the major building blocks of the society we want to win. And so, doing the local organizing is both a way to organize people around their really immediate needs, and they're the only people who can really organize around their immediate needs. And it's important as a way to sort of build the fabric of the kind of movement that we're going to need to win and the kind of world that we want to win. And I think that's why I think a lot about vision is because if you don't know where you're going, it's really hard to figure out how you want to get there. And I know that where I hope we're going is a society where people really participate in the decision making to the extent that it affects their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean that on the level of economy and the sort of like political affairs of their lives, and in the political affairs that manage the environment and culture and all those things. And if people are going to participate, they've got to be in contact with the people with whom they share, a space, and with whom they share institutions that carry out culture and that carry out, the decisions that affect their lives. So the local organizing is both, in a sense, a tool to fight back, but also the sort of basis for the society we want to build.
Okay, and so when you are involved as an organizer yourself or with a group that are trying to organize another group, can you describe some of the outreach methods you use for both the what we would call probably the mainstream population and maybe more importantly, um, an at-risk population, for example, undocumented immigrants who desperately need a voice and desperately need organization and assistance, but have a vested interest in not necessarily rising up and speaking out and being in front of a camera or something. So what kind of outreach and how do you build these coalitions and these groups?
Um, well, I mean, I think a really good example actually is Occupy Sandy, which I don't claim any credit for that stuff, but I'm in it and around it, and I think that also draws on a long experience of community organizing, that a lot of community organizations in New York City and around the country and around the world have practiced for a lot of generations. And I think again, it's partially this. I'm not. I think as far as like particular outreach methods, there's like a lot of door-to-door organizing, and there's educational programming, and there are actions and stuff like that, and all those different things draw people out of their homes and into places where they're together. But I think again, a lot of that is about immediate needs
Mm-hmm.
and real practical needs, but also about feeling powerful. I think a lot of local organizing and community organizing, particularly of in oppressed communities that are really battered and facing a lot of different crises at the same time. I think a lot of what breaks through the inability to act is the feeling that it's possible to win, and that we are actually fighting for something that's possible, and that we experience winning ever so often, which is what gives us the sort of drive to know that we can win more. And so I think, I think this kind of this like thinking about what winning looks like is really important to the organizing that we do.
And I like that. And I'm going to come into that thinking about what it looks like and also the vision issues in a bit. Um, just as a point of interest, do you find that it's easier to organize people around specific needs or ideas? Because my experience is it's difficult to organize people around ideas because they're kind of nebulous. But when you have a situation like Sandy, it's pretty much cut and dried and right there in front of you.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that I think it's kind of both, to be honest with you. I mean, I think that organizing that is done around ideas will really only ever appeal to certain groupings of people who have the sort of time and space to do that.
Hmm.
Um, and I also think organizing around practical needs or only around practical needs has its limitations. I think it limits itself. It like that kind of organizing limits itself by the possibilities that are immediately present. So if you're organizing people like, and I think, so I think it's a combination of both. And that's why I think Occupy Sandy is a really interesting model, for example, because you look at Occupy Sandy and it's not just organizing people in order to meet immediate needs. It's organizing people with the understanding that immediate needs are a priority, but it's using that as a forum through which to build groups that are actually capable of struggling over the long haul for real things. It's always about real things. Like even ideas have to be connected to real things, and but not all the real things are going to happen now. I mean, not all of the things we're fighting for are winnable in the near future. We need some of those things now in order to have the tools to be able to struggle over the long term. But if we're only struggling over the things we can win right now, we're going to be really limited because the system's broken. It's not just it's like those communities that are, that were hit by Hurricane Sandy were hit by crises long before Hurricane Sandy. I mean, those are communities that are facing really deep economic, political, and environmental crisis long before this hurricane. And so, if we limit ourselves to an organizing effort to relieve people from a particular crisis like this hurricane, then that's fine. But we leave all the other structures intact, and those communities are still vulnerable and they're still suffering and whatever. But you can't organize people who have real needs over something that's only in the long run, and that's a pitfall of some of
Right.
different kinds of organizing that only idea based or.
And that comes back to the vision and what is possible kind of thing and how important it is. And one of the examples we've been talking about is, you know, Occupy Wall Street went through its evolution, and so there's stuff still percolating, but a lot of people had written them off. And then Hurricane Sandy hit, and the response was immediate because they had the experience, they had the skills, they had the tools, they had the human infrastructure in place. And so it showed what all that precursor did. It showed what was possible and how quickly and rapidly they could respond and be effective.
Right.
Um, you
Exactly.
have the groups, let's say, for example, involved with Occupy Sandy, the various affinity groups around New York in the Northeast area. How do we go about connecting all these local groups to build critical mass of a movement with with focus on specific issues, or is that necessary?
Oh, that's a good question. I wish I was going to ask you. um, I think, well, I definitely think that there are moments of, crisis and or opportunity that draw a lot of groups out of the woodwork to kind of connect with one another. That I think was what Occupy was really about. It was this kind of like opportunity moment. It was just post like the deepest economic crisis and kind of like in the beginning of the climb out of that. And a lot of people saw opportunity with, some people saw opportunity, and then a week later, when it started to really balloon, more people saw opportunity, and then a couple weeks later, more people saw opportunity, and uh, and and I think that that's part of what gets people to come out. But I think that has really that kind of model has real limitations because the reality is most people are not in groups. Most people are not in affinity groups. Most people are not organized. Most people don't participate in political institutions. And that's, I think, at the bottom of what we really need to fix is like, if we got, the whole left, whatever that even really means at this point, if we got all of us in a room together, we wouldn't amount to enough to win. I mean, we're not there yet. We don't have the sort of like institutional foundation to be able to struggle for a long time. We don't have the kind of numbers we need. And I think that's the real challenge is more than getting the existing groups together is how do we build mass movements again? How do we rebuild the labor movement? How do we rebuild community institutions? How do we kind of like reinvigorate participation in community affairs, which is such a basic thing in a lot of the world that we don't have here in the U.S. This kind of just general practice of participating in things. Like in Europe, people go on strike just kind of because it's Wednesday or something, and it's like that's a culture we don't have here that we need to redevelop. I think that's I think there's no answer to it other than hard organizing, and it's not as sexy as something like Occupy,
Right.
but it's the truth. It's like those things are going to be limited. They're going to Occupy is kind of like a spike, right? It's this kind of like adrenaline jump,
Mm-hmm.
and that's really useful. It opens a lot of doors. It creates new possibilities. It like radicalizes a lot of people, et cetera, et cetera. But we don't have the sort of mass movement that carries that. We have only those spikes. So when it goes down, it goes all the way down.
Right.
And we don't have anything to keep it to push it even up. So I think I don't know if that's really an answer.
No, no, that actually was an answer because one of the things that I look at is the historical developments that most social change tends to happen because of a mass movement. So you go back into the late 20s, early 30s, the labor movements before they were crushed. The civil rights movement is an easy one to look at. And so there's a lot of conversation that I'm involved with is I think we need the mass and momentum, which is what prompted the question. But in your experience, is there any resistance to that, or it just hasn't gelled yet? As far because sometimes people are like, no, we want to maintain autonomy and individuality, and I'm like, well, that's great, but at what cost?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. There's definitely resistance to it. I think there's a lot of different tendencies on the left that don't always see eye to eye, and for sure, one of the kind of most problematic tendencies that I've seen, and there was some of this in Occupy, and there was other, I encountered this in other spaces that I've been in, is this kind of like this idea that crisis is actually what causes change, that deep crisis is what gets people mobilized, and then all it's going to take is this kind of like flash, and it's called the kind of like insurrection, like
Right.
that it's going to take all of us rising up, and the system will collapse, and then who knows what, because the theory doesn't really go much further than that, and I think that's a really problematic theory. Not to say that insurrections aren't necessary, and not to say that that those kind of crisis moments don't have something to do with it, but I think it's a really mischaracterization of the way social change happens. And I agree with what you just said, which is that every serious social transformation in any sense has been carried by mass movements. That's always the case. Even when we read in history books that a president did such and such a thing, it's always because there was like a public presence and public pressure and ultimately mass movements that drove them to do those things. And so, yeah, I do think there is pushback on that from a sort of like individualist perspective that is more than individualist. It's like an instant gratification thing. It's the same thing as it's very American. It's not only American. This is a trend that you experience in a lot of in a lot of lefts and also throughout history. But it does have this like very American character to it, which is this like instant gratification. Like we just kind of want to have the revolution now. And so like the idea that we're gonna have to spend 10, 20 years building a mass movement and institutions that can support it is like really not. It's really a drag, you know. And so I think there is that kind of resistance, which we've just got to get over it. And then there's obviously the real resistance, which is the right wing. And I mean, movements get crushed. Movements, you know, and all sorts of movements get attacked by like reactionary forces, especially when they're becoming successful. And you know, that's a real thing to contend with at different stages of struggle. Contending with that looks different, but make no mistake about it. I mean, people with power don't want us building movements for sure, and they make it their business to stop that, and they do it all the time.
Um, so it's safe to say that you are a proponent of building critical mass for social change. That tends to be where you are with it. Okay. I just wanted to make sure that we had that clear. So being a student of such things and participating on a daily basis in it, can you draw the relationship for us um, between, let's say, the actions that are happening in Greece now? And we interviewed somebody from Nebraska last week that was talking about their local responses to the floods. You know, they did community organizing, fed, and how those seemingly separate issues are related. Can you draw that line for us?
Well, I don't know. I mean, you might have to do it because that's a tricky one. But for sure, I mean, well, you know, I think that what I was saying before, I think is maybe I could just replug that in is that, you know, I talk a lot about the local stuff, or I talked a bit about the necessity for building community power, but that's not going to amount to much, you know, each in a different place without a sort of understanding that that's part of a global movement and also fighting global systems. And so, austerity here is not different from austerity in Greece. It's different, and it's in the way that it's expressed.
Right.
It's different in the way that people are affected by it because Greece plays a different role in the global capitalist market than New York does. But for sure, austerity is a global trend, and it's part of neoliberal capitalism, and it's like in the DNA of that economic system. And so, you know, there's just no sense in fighting it in one of the two places, right, and not in both.
That was sort of what I was looking for, because I often say austerity is austerity no matter the language. It's all the same thing, and all coming from the same sources, I believe. So you mentioned several times winning and, you know, rising up and solving these problems. So what does winning look like? What does it look like for you?
Well, I think it looks different in different times and places. I think right now, so I think there are kind of different stages of, I guess, demands, but not demands in a narrow sense. Demands as in like the world we demand. Mm-hmm. And I think that it depends really, I guess, what we're talking about. If we're talking about austerity, then I think right now it means an end to like austerity measures and budget cuts, which close like hospitals and schools and AIDS clinics and libraries and firehouses and whatever. And that's what it looks like in New York in Greece it looks like that, and massive unemployment, and et cetera. I think something that's possible to win if we build a movement to confront it now is an end to austerity measures, or that's possible to win some of that. But I think in the future, I think I think we want to win an economy that we actually democratically control, um, and a society that we actually control, that we participate in the decisions that affect our lives to the extent to which they affect them. And that's why I talk about about vision being important, but also about the understanding that that we've got to win things now to put us in the position to win things in the future. Um, you can't just like there's no such thing as just like revolution as an event.
Right.
It's like a process.
Yeah, again with the instant gratification though, and one of the interesting things has been watching what happens in Europe and Egypt, um, and overseas unfolding where they have massive amounts of people out every day doing things, but the change is still incremental and slow. And so I feel like, okay, where's our massive amount of people? And last week I was in a conversation. I said, okay, so let's say the premise is it takes a crisis to generate the ability to mobilize people. I said we have 100 crises, and it is still not happening. So that means to me, okay, it's not the crises that spark it. It's got to be something else, and whatever that is, I don't know. It's the $1 million question, right?
Yeah, totally. No, you're right on. I mean, if the crisis theory were true, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Right.
How low is low enough? How bad is bad enough? And there are people in the world who have nothing to eat, who are like who live in in like who live in ghettos, who have bombs being dropped on them every day. And it's like if that's not enough of a crisis, then you know
Right.
the truth is the crisis actually makes it really hard for people to respond.
Well, yeah, I think people get overwhelmed, and it's also a huge distraction because it's like the crisis of the week. Not to minimize it because it's legit, but still, if you're just responding to every crisis that props up, there's one every week.
Right, right, yeah, and no, I mean it drains an enormous amount of resources, and it it's really hard to build a movement made up of people who don't have their basic needs met.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just the truth about some of what we need to do. In some cases, we do need to build a movement of people who can't meet their basic needs in order to help meet their basic needs. But to think that on its own is going to bring capital crashing down is like it doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't.
Right.
And it's cruel. It's also a cruel theory. It means that you have to stand by and let shitty things happen because of some sort of abstract theory that's going to mobilize people. Where actually just throughout history, it's not true that happens. Actually, what's much more likely is that people mobilize and rise up just after winning something,
Right.
because all of a sudden they think it's possible to live in a better world than the one they live in.
Yep.
And that's part of the reason that it's so important to actually win real concrete things for people, both to meet people's needs and provide sort of like a basis for continued struggle, but also just to believe that that's possible. I think that a lot of, and I feel this way too, a lot of the time, just handicapped by not feeling that so much is possible. And I think that's part of what we're doing right now, actually, is changing possibilities. There's a lot of people who believe that a lot more is possible now than they thought a year ago. And that's really important. That makes people behave differently.
Yeah.
And then it opens up.
Exactly. I mean, I find just I live in a very rural place, and I'm doing what I can, and I have recently discovered that probably the biggest challenge is just educating people and encouraging them and let them know, hey, you can make a difference, because I get that a lot. It's like, well, I understand what the problem is, but what can I do? I say, well, you have a neighbor who I know for a fact didn't eat yesterday, so you can make biscuits and beans and take over them. That's something. And then their response is, but that's so small. Well, yeah, but it's not nothing, you know. And then they become encouraged that a person can take an action as an individual that can have a positive effect for other person. And once you help establish that, people can grab a hold of it. I think so. But this show's about you, not about me and my. So for our last few minutes, I want to get into a little bit about um, your ideas about vision and proactive work. How can activists get in front of an issue instead of behind it? Because a lot of things seem to be a reaction to something that already happens, and I'm at the point already where I feel like, okay, if, for instance, um, tar sands, once we start hearing about it, it's really too late because those decisions have already been made. So nothing we do is going to stop it. So how to get out in front of these things? What can we do?
Yeah. That's a really good question. I guess two things come to mind, and I think I've alluded to both at one point or another. So I'm just kind of repeating. Sorry if I repeat myself, but um, one thing is vision. Is we have to have an idea of what we want. Because if we don't know what we want, then all we're going to be able to do is kind of play defense against, what they want. We know what they want. It's really bad. And so, if we know what we want and we develop vision and we develop sort of the values of the world that we want, and begin to think about what that would look like. And it doesn't have to be a blueprint, and it doesn't, a lot of those things get formed in struggle. And as we struggle, we develop like more and more nuanced ideas of what it is we want. But I think part of it is knowing ahead of time what we want, so that when we're in struggle, we already know where we're trying to go, and we get to keep trying to go there, and respond to crisis, but put it into our narrative as opposed to theirs. And the other is having institutions to be able to respond. I think that if you look at Occupy Sandy, part of what was so special about it was that occupiers managed to kind of like spring into action way before anybody else did. And part of that, I think a lot of that is because we had built a sort of like institutional foundation to be able to do that. And when I say institutions, I don't mean necessarily big office buildings or like name tags or whatever. I mean the sort of like social relations that accomplish things, and frameworks,
Right.
frameworks and processes that get things done. And I think, if you look at Occupy Sandy, you'll see a lot of progress made on an institutional level
Mm-hmm.
from Occupy.
Yes.
Like, for example, the thing, at Occupy, if you came to Liberty Square and there was an assembly going on, you could just join that assembly and you immediately have the right to block whatever happens at that assembly. And here at Occupy Sandy, when you come to an Occupy Sandy hub, you go to an orientation and you get trained. And you have to be trained in order to go out to Coney Island to do, canvassing to assess people's needs. And again, and I would say there are a lot of shortcomings to all that. I mean, I was doing some of these trainings, and it was like half-hour trainings for stuff that people have spent lifetimes, learning about in order to do well. So it's not perfect by any means, but even just those very basic institutional relations are forming and improving. And I think that a lot of what Occupy Sandy actually relied on were all these sort of like networks, some of which were informal and some of which weren't, to be able to sort of like spring into action and have a functional basis to carry stuff out. Yep. And I think we need to put it at this level in a really big way. Like, I think that networks, like loose networks, are really important, but you can only really network things that are already moving. Right. And people come out in the streets when there's a crisis or when there's opportunity or whatever, and then you can network them. And that's what Occupy did, is there was this thing that happened that brought a lot of people out into the streets, and some of it was because of Occupy Wall Street itself, and some of it was because of the hard organizing that had been done for decades before, and some of it was because of the crisis, and some of it was because whatever. And then it became, when I was helping organize for October 15th, which was kind of like one of our bigger days of action, and it just took, having a good plan, helping organize, some of the people who were on the ground and putting out a call. And a lot of people just came out because they were already out. And it's easy to network people when they're already out. Mm-hmm. But in the winter, they weren't out anymore, and or for the most part.
Right.
And we didn't know how to network those people anymore because they were at home. They weren't out in the streets, and it's so much harder. Then your Facebook are not enough to get people out into the streets.
Thank you for
And
saying that part. I mean, I'm a big believer in social networking tools, but it doesn't stop there. It's not enough. It has to be face to face and person to person.
yeah, and there's got to be tools. There's got to be structures that allow for people to do the like one-on-ones and the door knocking and the phone calls and there's got to be people have to be able to meet their needs while they struggle. There's got to be a structure for that. There's got to be a way to get people to allow people to plug in even though they can't commit their whole lives to it. I mean, there's a lot of things that you need, just structures to be able to do efficiently, that keep people in motion for the hard times, not for the easy times. It's easy to move people when they're already being moved. We need to figure out how to move people when they're not. That's the hard work that a lot of these like community organizations, and that's what labor organizing is about. It's those winter moments that are actually much more important
Right.
than
Um, and I just wanted to make the point, you're referencing Occupy Sandy a lot, and the viewers and chatters may not know, but that are heavily involved in that effort from the beginning and still currently. And I just want to give a shout out to you and all the others involved in that effort on the ground. It's just been phenomenal to watch from afar, and it's makes me so proud to be involved even from a distance. But the things you people are doing there are absolutely incredible, and there are many people nationwide that are watching this thing and learning so much from the example you're setting and the work that you're doing. Um, I'm interested in organization, operations, and logistics. I've done disaster recovery in other places, and the response you guys have put together there around the city and the islands has been phenomenal. So, much respect for all that, for all you people who are working on that.
well, I really appreciate it. I wasn't there in the beginning. I was stuck in Hoboken, but but I appreciate it, and it's really humbling. It's really amazing to see people take control of their own communities. And that's it's been a real lesson. It's like people really know what they're facing, and they really know what they want, and they just kind of need to be put in a room to
Right.
talk about
And allowed to talk about it and have their voice, and then people need to listen. So I think we're going to go ahead and wrap this. I have one more question, and it kind of summarizes a question that came up in the chat, and it's one that I have. Um, Really important to a lot of us. A lot of our viewers are scattered all over the United States and Canada. We have a couple in Mexico. A lot of us are in small, remote areas. We all have the same issues and problems. The in the county I live in, there's a 25% of the population has food security issues. That I'm learning that's a nationwide statistic, and that may even be low. So, as an organizer and an activist and an educator, what advice would you have to individuals that are watching about how to prepare for changes or how to be proactive as as an individual in our small communities or our neighborhoods?
it.
I know that's a big
I
question.
think you ask a lot of really big questions. um, I think a lot of it has to do with organizing people around the issues that they're actually facing. And I guess, look, I'm not a very trained organizer, and I'm not exactly sure what the rule books say, but the sneaking suspicion I have is that a lot of organizing really has to do with one-on-one conversations, and getting people into a public space where they're becoming active participants in the society around them. People have a lot of issues that they're encountering, and they know what they are, and I think that what it takes is getting people to talk about those things and start to identify who has power in the decision making that affects our lives on any particular issue, and what do we want, where are we, what do we want, and then how do we get there. And I think in some senses, it's really big. It's this like really big, complex thing because we're dealing with global systems, and we're dealing with incredibly powerful people. Um, and so it's kind of hard to wrap your head around it. And in other senses, it's really small. Like, there's a lot of places around this. I actually learned this in a really silly way, actually, doing in a kind of unexpectedly in New York when we did Bloombergville, which was this 2 week occupation against the city budget cuts, and it was really scrawny. And let me tell you, it was like small and not a mass thing, not popular. For none of you would even know it existed if it wasn't for Occupy, because it was later than like after the fact. People were like, "Oh, that was probably like a thing that helped us do," whatever. But during that time, it was really not a big thing, and not a lot of people were plugged into it. But we would still get these phone calls where people were telling us that the mayor was really pissed off because the mayor had to walk by us every day. And you think about Bloomberg as like a billionaire, and he's got what, the seventh largest military in the continent or something like that. Just like the NYPD, and is a really powerful guy, and you feel like very very far away from a guy like that. And then we got under his skin. It pissed him off, and he's a player in this game as an individual too. And so that it's actually like it's funny to think of New York as kind of like a smaller town than you might think. And so that's got to be true everywhere else in the country as well. And I think a lot of that has to do with I think most questions I would about strategy and about tactics and about how to do things. I think most of the time I end up thinking groups. Starting groups really is the most important thing. And I don't mean just, I mean even just us as we're trying to figure ourselves out. I mean, one person asking you that question on the chat is much more powerful when it's 3, 4, 5 people together trying to
Mm-hmm.
figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a support system and an organizing structure to be able to figure out what we can do.
Right. So that I think that's a wonderful way to leave it. And a lot of times we ask our guests for a call to action, and I think you just gave it to us. Start a group, have a conversation, listen to what people need, or say what we need, and then go from there. That'll be our point of departure. So, do you have any closing thoughts you'd like to make, or anything else, or are you about talked out?
No, I'm okay. Um, No, I think I really appreciate it. I think your questions are right on, and I wish I had the time to ask them all back to you, and your viewers. I feel like it's questions that we all need to deal with together. I appreciate your time and all the flattery.
Yeah, well, you may have just, you know, probably put yourself in an awkward spot because for months people have been saying, "Oh, we want you to be interviewed," and I'm going, "Yeah, but who's going to interview me?" So you'll probably be getting a call.
Okay,
All right. Well,
cool.
thank you so much. We really
Well,
appreciate your time and all your work. Take care of your health. It's a long haul, and I know you're struggling with epic things there. I really
same to
appreciate
you.
your writing and everything you're doing, and thank you for giving us the time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's really been a pleasure, and
Okay.
good luck.
Take care. Have a good evening.
Okay, bye.